Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Cut Rate Commander, the series in which we take a look at low-price commanders and make budget decks with them. My name's Grazzet, and today we'll be looking at a build featuring the ooze that puts the harm back in harmonicon, Felix Five-Boots. But before we continue, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you like this content, and if you really like it, please consider supporting the channel directly either through my Buy Me a Coffee or through our Game Nerds affiliate links in the description. Also, be sure to stick around until the end of the video to see what commander we'll be covering next and what commanders you'll be voting for an upcoming episode. So, with that out of the way, let's start by taking a look at the commander and playstyle. Felix Five-Boots is a 5/4 ooze rogue with Menace and Ward 2 that costs 2 and Sultai that has the following ability. If a creature we control dealing combat damage to a player causes the triggered ability of a permanent we control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. Breaking down his core stats, Felix is sporting a somewhat hefty CMC, an average power but slightly below average toughness body for his cost that is somewhat made up for by his built-in pseudo-evasion and soft targeting protection, and an ability that lets us get even more mileage out of combat damage dealing effects by allowing us to double up on them. Now, generally speaking, any card that lets us double up on anything, no matter how narrow it is, tends to be good, particularly those that we have access to from the command zone, and Felix here is no exception. Empowering Sultai's no small shortage of on-damage dealing effect creatures and payoffs to be twice as effective. That, combined with Sultai's easy access to creatures with built-in trample and/or evasion, and reliable ways to grant those abilities to our non-trampling or evasive creatures to get in for damage, makes Felix a very simple but devastatingly effective commander. So the question then becomes, what's the best way to build around Felix? We can certainly build him the same way we did Gonti Canny Acquisitor, going really low to the ground with evasive bodies and taking advantage of efficient built-in and AoE sources of on-combat damage effects to generate us a lot of value. And while that build would be effective, I figured this time around we could take the build in the complete opposite direction, instead focusing on high CMC on-combat damage dealing creatures to take advantage of the powerful on-damage effects they bring to the table, and using Sultai's impressive ramp package to get us there, enabling us to play gigantic threat after gigantic threat that Felix makes twice as deadly. Still, that doesn't mean we won't be taking advantage of some lower CMC entrants that have powerful on-damage effects of their own, or that can grant additional on-combat effects to our big creatures to get even more value out of them as they connect, and, alongside them, a decent suite of protection and spell disruption sources to help keep our commander alive and our board state intact, allowing Felix and his gang of enormous damage-dealing thugs to run roughshod at the table. So let us make our way to Thunder Junction yet again, this time to the dusty road outside of Yuma's bar, where we'll find Felix engaging in his favorite pastime, a duel. Now, one would think an ooze has no business being a gunslinger, but in fact, Felix has never lost. His opponents can never read him on account of having no face, his 5 quote-unquote feet give him the most stable dueling stance possible, and even if his opponent draws first, his lack of internal organs makes him damn near impossible to even hurt. Honestly, the real question is why folks keep challenging him to duels in the first place, but Felix doesn't really care since he gets to enjoy himself. Or at least we think so? It's hard to tell, due to the lack of face thing. So, now that we know a bit more about the commander and playstyle, let's start looking at the deck itself by starting with the creatures. Starting things off with our creature base, the first thing we'll be doing is filling up this build with the most dangerous creatures with the most powerful on-damage effects we can muster to get the maximum mileage out of Felix, doubling up on those effects for us, preferably on bodies with some form of built-in evasion or the ability to trample over blockers reliably. So, on the evasive side of things to take blocking out of the equation entirely, we'll be slotting in Lord of the Void, Dazzling Sphinx, and Grima Saruman's Footman, all of which let us steal and cast spells off our opponent's decks at no mana cost as we connect with them, the first letting us steal their creatures, while the other two let us make use of their instants and sorceries instead, Sharding Sphinx and Tyrannid Harridan, both of which let us create evasive token bodies as they connect that exponentially grow our board as we keep keep connecting in with them and the tokens they create turn after turn, Schema Thief, which nets us copies of the most powerful artifacts at the table as it gets in for damage, and Vanguard Suppressor, which not only lets us use it to generate repeatable card advantage as it cracks in, but also lets us pump mana into it to get extra copies of it thanks to Squad to take advantage of our build's impressive ramp package. Then, as some slightly less mana-intensive evasive entries, we'll be adding in Shadow Mage Infiltrator and Cold-Eyed Selkie as more on-damage draw effects to keep our hands nice and full as we crack in with them, Thief of Sanity as a way to generate value off our opponent's decks as we deal damage with it instead, Malcolm Alluring Scoundrel as initially a piece of repeatable card selection and graveyard setup that later turns into a source of free spells for us, who our commander gets online in half the time, Trigon Predator as some back row spot removal to help us disrupt our opponent's boards, and Adrana Liberator of Malakir as a way to grow all our creatures with +1/+1 counters as we continually swing in with them to proc their effects. Now, switching gears from creatures that can go over blockers and onto those that will crash through them instead in order to inflict damage, we'll be adding in Mindleech Mass, who gives us another way to cast spells off our opponents at no mana cost, this time by ripping them out of their hands to also deny them resources, Ogier Castlum Deepest Growth, which instead lets us cheat out our own creatures and lands from our deck as she cracks in, on top of also being very hard to permanently remove thanks to her ability to turn into a land upon destruction that we can easily flip back, Giant Ataphage, which can exponentially multiply its 7/7 trampling stat block as it slams into our opponents to flood the board with massive bodies, Storev Devkarin Lich, which lets us recur our creatures back to hand from our bin to ensure that our biggest threats can find their way back to the battlefield even if they're destroyed, Aberrant, which takes advantage of our build's considerable ramp package to grow in size and potentially cantrip if we pump enough mana into it thanks to Ravenous, while also serving as another piece of repeatable back row destruction, and Conclave Sledge Captain, whose triple backup 1 lets up to 3 of our non-evasive and or non-trampling creatures borrow its trample for a turn to get in for damage and grow themselves with counters as they do so when it comes down, and then remains as an ever-growing threat itself as it cracks in on subsequent turns. And then to round out our array of creatures with on-combat damage effects, with some entrants who are not naturally evasive or trampling, but whose effects are powerful enough to warrant their inclusion anyway, we have Glissa Sunslayer, who may as well be evasive thanks to her combination of First Strike and Death Touch, allowing her to safely take down almost anything that blocks her, and whose ability to either destroy enchantments, draw us cards, or strip away counters provides our build with very nice repeatable disruption and value depending on what we need, Archpriest of Shadows, which can use its backup to turn one of our more reliable damage-dealing creatures into a reanimation spell as it comes down to resurrect our fallen creatures, and it then sticks around to continue reanimating our creature base as it gets in for damage, and lastly, Fallen Shinobi and Silent Blade Oni, both of which can take advantage of our cheaper evasive creatures and evasive tokens to get in for damage initially thanks to their ninjutsu, and enable us to get more free spells off our opponents from either their decks or their hands as they connect. So, now that we've covered all our creatures that have on-damage effects of their own, let's pivot slightly onto creatures that care about if they or any of our other creatures get in for damage to proc their effects, such as Toski Bearer of Secrets, Orin Frostfang, and Grazzelix Illithid Scholar, all of which turn our combat damage into repeatable card advantage, with the second also granting AoE Death Touch as we crack in to synergize spectacularly with our trampling creatures, and the third giving us the ability to quote-unquote reset our backup and ninjutsu creatures by bouncing them back to our hand if they're blocked so we can use those abilities again, Marcus Mutant Mayor, who also functions as another AoE on-combat damage draw source, though he initially grants all our creatures a +1/+1 counter instead if they don't have one already to allow them to hit even harder, all while being a decent-sized vigilant and trampling threat himself, Orochi Soul Reaver, which instead pads our core stats by providing ramp in the form of treasures as our creatures get in for combat damage, in addition to also manifesting cards from their deck to both build up our board state and potentially steal their best creatures for ourselves. Irashidiki the Usurper, who essentially grants all our creatures lifelink as they connect with our opponents to help stabilize our life totals against even the most burn-heavy matchups. And, to round out this lot, the partner pair Ukima Stalking Shadow and Kazor Ruthless Stalker, as well as Necropolis Regent, which function as another source of +1/+1 counter distribution as our creatures get in for damage, with the partner pair coming down fast and tutoring each other for added consistency, while the Regent grows our creatures much faster while being a huge evasive threat itself. And then to wrap up our creature base, we'll be slotting in Sakura Tribelder as some staple green land ramp to help us speed up and fix our mana base so we can quickly and reliably get to Felix and our other high CMC creatures. That covers all our creatures, so let's move on to our instance. It's going to be removal all the way down as we enter our instant category, as we'll be wanting as much interaction as possible to remove anything that could block our creatures and or prevent our creatures from attacking, as well as to protect our commander and our high value creatures from removal, with the former camp seeing us add in Assassin's Trophy, Beast Within, and Putrefy, so we can deal with a wide variety of both front row and back row threats at flash speed to prevent our opponents from gaining a foothold, and a latter camp seeing us slot in the counterspells Arcane Denial, Counterspell, Countersquall, and Negate to disrupt any of our opponent's attempts to remove our commander or our on-damage dealing threats from the board so they can keep swinging in for longer. That covers all our instants, so let's move on to our sorceries. Much like our previous category, our sorceries are going to see us pad our core stats even more, being comprised of the land ramp spells Farseek, Nature's Lore, Rampant Growth, 3 Visits, Cultivate, Kodama's Reach, Explosive Vegetation, and Migration Path, all of which are superb sources of ramp that help us speed up and or fix our mana base, so that we can get to our high CMC commander and creatures as quickly and as reliably as possible, and a board wipe in Garruk's Wake, which our aforementioned ramp package will easily enable us to cast despite its enormous mana cost, and lets us level all our opponent's creature base while leaving ours untouched so we can crack in with impunity. That covers all our sorceries, so let's move on to our enchantments. We'll only be running a pair of enchantments this time around, both of which are on combat damage payoffs, namely Feywild Visitor, whose ability to generate us up to 3 evasive bodies per rotation grows up to 6 alongside Felix to build up our board state even faster, and Reconnaissance Mission, which gives us another on-combat damage source of draw for our evasive and trampling creatures to make use of, this time from the relative safety of our back row. That covers all our enchantments, so let's move on to our artifacts. Upon entering our artifact category, the first thing we'll be doing is adding in one last combat damage payoff to the build in the form of Bident of Thassa, which functions as yet another source of on-combat damage draw for added redundancy, and whose AoE pseudo-goad is also quite useful for us in order to tap down most of our opponent's blockers, so that our trampling and non-evasive creatures can get in for damage more reliably. Then from there, we'll be slotting in a small suite of equipment that not only grants the equipped creature additional on-damage effects for them to double up on, but also gives them the ability to go over or through blockers if they are unable to do so already. Consisting of Mask of Riddles, whose fear granting lets the equipped creature generally be able to attack at least one opponent at the table that's not in black or colorless, on top of also making that creature a repeatable source of card advantage as it cracks in, along with Power Fist and Scepter of Celebration, which instead grant the equipped creature trample to crash through blockers and load themselves up with +1/+1 counters or create swarms of creature tokens for us as they do so. And lastly, despite not enabling the equipped creature to get in for damage, we'll also be running the Key to the Vault, which our already evasive and trampling creatures can take advantage of to let us cast spells for free off the top of our deck as they get in. Then, briefly staying on the topic of equipment, but switching focus onto keeping our creatures alive, we'll be adding in both Lightning Greaves and Swiftfoot Boots, both of which provide solid targeting protection to help keep Felix and our high-value targets alive for longer, as well as being haste enablers to allow those high-value targets to swing in as soon as they come down, rather than having to wait a full rotation to make use of their on-combat damage dealing effects. And then to close out our artifacts, we'll be speeding up our mana base even further by adding in the Mana Rocks Soul Ring and Arcane Signet, along with the Land Ramp Source Wayfarer's Bauble for even more cheap ramp and or fixing, as well as Thought Vessel and Decanter of Endless Water, both of which speed up our mana base even further, and also remove our maximum hand size limit so we can take the maximum advantage of all our combat damage dealing draw sources without overdrawing ourselves. That covers all our artifacts, and since we won't be running any planeswalkers in this build, let's jump straight into our land base. Quickly going over our mana lands, we'll be running Command Tower and Opulent Palace as lands that tap for all three of our colors for maximum fixing, the check lands Drowned Catacomb, Hinterland Harbor, and Woodland Cemetery, along with the battle land Sunken Hollow, all of which are dual lands that take advantage of our basics and lands with basic land types to come into play untapped for even more fast access to our colors, with the last one also being fetchable by Farseek thanks to its built-in basic land types. The Painlands Llanowar Wastes and Yavimaya Coast, along with the Filter Land Flooded Grove, which are even more duels that come into play untapped for even better fixing. The tapped duels Haunted Mire and Tangled Islet, which may be slow, but we're running due to them having basic land types, thereby making them fetchable by our non-basic land ramp sources for added consistency. And lastly, Blighted Woodland and Myriad Landscape, both of which give us one last bit of land-based ramp from our land slot in order to let us cast even our biggest creatures with ease. Then for utility lands, we'll be adding in Rogue's Passage as yet another source of on-demand evasion to enable our non-evasive creatures to get in without having to worry about blockers at all, as well as Reliquary Tower to give us yet another way to remove our maximum hand size limit and get the most use out of our repeatable draw sources. And finally, we'll be running 6 islands, 6 swamps, and 9 forests as our basics to close out our land base. So, now that we've covered all the cards in the deck, let's take a look at this deck's breakdown. Looking at the stats that matter to our game plan, we have 27 cards that are either creatures with on-combat damage effects of their own, or are instead means to grant our creatures on-combat damage effects to ensure that Felix has plenty of effects to double up for us. 12 cards that care about any of our creatures dealing combat damage to net us even more value as we crack in with our creatures, 18 cards that are either naturally evasive or can grant evasion, alongside 9 cards with built-in trample or that can grant trample to ensure that the majority of our creature base can overcome blockers to reliably get in for damage and proc their effects, and lastly, 2 sources of targeted removal protection to work alongside our spell disruption to help keep our commander and our more powerful on-combat damage dealing effect creatures alive for longer. For general deck stats, we have 18 ramp sources, 12 card draw sources, 10 targeted removal sources, and 1 board wipe, with our ramp being higher than average, which is mainly there to compensate for this build's larger than average mana curve. And looking at said mana curve, we have an average CMC of 3.64, leaving us with a heavyweight curve that we'll need to dedicate the early game into ramping as hard as possible in order for us to quickly get to our high CMC spells. Then, once our mana base has been established, it's just a matter of getting 1 or 2 evasive and or trampling creatures with powerful on-combat damage effects on the board, followed by our commander to double up on those effects to begin taking over the game. From there, we simply need to keep building up our board with more and more on-combat damage effects and payoffs to keep doubling up on with Felix, while keeping Felix and our board state intact against our opponent's attempts to dismantle it with our protection sources and counter spells, until the sheer amount of value Felix generates for us and the size of our creatures becomes too much for our opponents to be able to contend with. Currently, this deck is valued at $65.30, not counting the price of basic lands or shipping. This price was calculated by using the cheapest listed marketplace price on TCG Player at the time of this recording. Now, if we would like to side grade our deck in one direction or another without going over budget, we can consider slotting out Mask of Riddles and Scepter of Celebration in favor of Stolen Identity and Writ of Return, which may cost more and don't grant our creatures the ability to reliably get in for damage, but instead take advantage of our existing evasive and trampling creatures to get repeatable clone effects and reanimations as they get in for damage thanks to Cypher. And Ikra Shadiki the Usurper can possibly be exchanged out for Hydra Omnivore, which forgoes keeping us alive to more reliably finish off our opponents with the huge amount of burn it can inflict, which only gets better as we make it bigger, so long as we can reliably get it in for damage. Then, if we want to upgrade the build by going over budget, we can instead scrap Mask of Riddles and Scepter of Celebration in favor of Sword of Forge and Frontier and Sword of War and Peace as a moderate upgrade, with these blades providing solid evasion and resilience versus removal thanks to the protection they provide, as well as granting the equipped creature respectable on-combat damage dealing effects for us to double up on. Storev Drevkarin Lich can be benched to open up space for Grim Hireling as a significant upgrade, which can generate us a staggering 12 treasures per rotation alongside Felix as our creatures get in for damage, which it can then turn into repeatable non-destruction removal to pick apart our opponent's boards with. And then, if we want to add even more on-combat damage effects and payoffs at the cost of not paying our electric bill for a month, we can slot out Feywild Visitor, Decanter of Endless Water, Sharding Sphinx, and Tyrannid Harridan, so we can slot in Sword of Feast and Famine, Sword of Fire and Ice, Ancient Brass Dragon, and Old Gnawbone, with the first two providing even more solid protection and powerful on-combat damage effects that can ramp us, draw us cards, or deal more damage to our opponents, while the latter two instead offer us more evasive bodies with terrifying on-damage effects that either let us mass reanimate swaths of creatures from anyone's bin, or flood the board with more treasures than we know what to do with. Thanks everyone for sticking around until the end of the video. Firstly, before we continue, I'd like to take a moment to thank all of the channel subscribers for having helped the channel reach its 19.5k subscriber milestone. We're just 500 shy of that coveted 20k subscriber milestone, and it's all thanks to your continued support. So sincerely, thank you. Now, with our Felix Five-Boots build covered, the next commander we'll be tackling will be last week's poll winner, the girl who punched through time, Obeka Splitter of Seconds, so look forward to that build coming soon. Then moving on to this week's poll, we'll have a trio of outlaws attempting to coerce their way into builds of their own, with those being the Aura Weaponizing Warlock, Ariette the Beguiler, the Creature Petrifying Assassin, Vraska the Silencer, and a Creature Sacking Rogue, Akul the Unrepentant. So be sure to cast your votes, link in the description, before the deadline on May 10th, and let me know in the comments which commander you voted for, and which commanders from this set you'd like to see me feature in future polls. And again, before we close out, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy this content. Consider donating to buy me a coffee or use my Game Nerds affiliate link if you want to support the channel directly. And if you'd like to see more videos like this one, either click on the videos floating around my head for the latest builds, or click on the card above for a playlist of all the deck techs I've made so far. And with that, have a good one folks, and stay safe.